I still remember the night as if it just happened. The kind of night that holds a heavy silence, like it knows something it won't tell you. Little did I know, what began as a simple conversation with Thomas, my husband's friend, would soon bring me to question everything about loyalty, trust, and boundaries. I never imagined I'd end up so close to a line I promised myself I'd never cross. My husband, Robert, and Thomas had been friends since childhood, bonded over every memory from schoolyard fights to college celebrations. When Robert and I married, Thomas became a frequent presence in our lives. We'd spent countless weekends hosting barbecues, laughing over silly inside jokes, and sharing stories that made us all feel like family. To me, Thomas was like a brother. Or at least that's what I thought for a long time. It started subtly, in a way you don't notice until you look back. Robert was away for work, a frequent pattern in his career. I'd grown accustomed to his absence, but that night felt lonelier than usual. Thomas dropped by to check in, saying he was nearby and thought he'd stop to say hello. There was nothing unusual about that. He had always been a caring friend, considerate enough to see if I needed anything. I appreciated that. He stayed for a while and we talked about everything. Robert's new project, our lives, even little things like how my son was adjusting to school. It felt easy, comfortable, and innocent, like two friends catching up. But the longer he stayed, the more I noticed subtle changes in our conversation. His eyes lingered a bit too long. His words seemed slightly loaded, hinting at something unspoken. I brushed it off. After all, it was Thomas. As the evening wore on, he confessed how lonely he had been feeling lately, how disconnected he sometimes felt from those around him. I listened sympathetically, thinking it was just the venting of a close friend. But then he mentioned how he had always admired me, not just as Robert's wife, but as someone he felt understood him in ways others didn't. I felt a shift in my chest, a strange mix of emotions I couldn't quite define. Was he implying something more? Or was I simply reading too much into his words? I quickly redirected the conversation, trying to steer us back into safer, familiar territory. But it was as though he was waiting for the right moment, as if he had something he needed to say, or maybe something he hoped I'd feel. Then came the incident that left a mark, one I haven't been able to shake since. Late into the night, he decided to leave, and I walked him to the door. We lingered there, saying our goodbyes. As I reached for the door, he leaned in closer than I expected, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath. My heart skipped in that moment, and I froze. A strange silence fell between us. He looked at me with a gaze that said more than words ever could, a look that made me question if he had come over purely out of friendship. I felt an overwhelming need to retreat, to end this ambiguous moment before it escalated. I mumbled something about needing to go to bed and quickly shut the door, locking it behind him. Yet even after he was gone, I felt his presence linger, the memory of that moment refusing to fade. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but replay our evening in my mind. His words, his gaze, that final moment at the door, it all felt too close, too intense. A strange mixture of guilt and confusion swept over me. Part of me wanted to believe it was all in my head, a misunderstanding. But another part of me couldn't shake the thought that he might have felt something more. And perhaps I did too. The following days were difficult. Every time Robert called, I felt a pang of guilt, though I hadn't technically done anything wrong. I was torn between my loyalty to my husband and an inexplicable curiosity about what Thomas had left unsaid. It was a line I knew I couldn't cross, and yet it felt so close, as if one small push could topple everything. Days later, when my son came into my room early one morning, asking if Thomas could come over and play soccer with him, I froze. The thought of seeing him again made my heart race with a combination of excitement and apprehension. I told myself it was just an innocent visit, just my son's wish to see a family friend. But deep down, I knew things would never quite be the same. I thought seeing Thomas again would help clear things up, that I could somehow convince myself that night was just a misunderstanding. But I was wrong. The next time he came over, it was as though an unspoken tension lingered between us, like we both knew something had shifted. and neither of us knew how to address it. He showed up that Saturday afternoon to kick around the soccer ball with my son, Ethan. I stayed inside, trying to keep busy in the kitchen, glancing through the window as they laughed and ran around the yard. I told myself that my feelings were in my head, just an overreaction, but there was a part of me that couldn't deny how much I was anticipating a simple moment alone with him. A chance to talk, to find some closure. The guilt gnawed at me. Eventually, they came back in, flushed from the afternoon sun, and Thomas, ever so casually, asked if he could stay a little longer for coffee. Ethan was already running off to his room, leaving us alone in the living room. It felt like a repeat of the last time he visited, but this time the silence between us felt more weighted. As I poured coffee, Thomas started talking about his life again. He mentioned how disconnected he felt and how he struggled to find any real connection in his relationships. He sighed, then looked up at me in a way that seemed to peel back the walls I'd tried so hard to build. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, and for the first time, I felt like I was seeing him as more than just my husband's friend. I tried to steer the conversation away, to keep it light, but he didn't let me. He leaned forward, his voice soft. "Sarah," he said, "I need to know if I'm crazy or if you've been feeling the same way. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since that night." His words hung in the air and I felt my chest tighten. It was everything I'd been trying to ignore. Everything I'd been telling myself wasn't real. But here he was, saying it out loud, confirming what I'd tried to dismiss. My heart was racing, a mix of fear and excitement. I didn't know what to say, and for a moment I simply looked away, hoping he'd realize the impossibility of what he was suggesting. But he pressed on. "I know it's wrong, Sarah, but I can't help how I feel. I see you, and I just feel understood. Like you get me in a way no one else does." I felt a painful knot in my stomach. I knew I was supposed to tell him to leave, to cut off any chance of this continuing. But instead, I sat there, silently battling my own emotions. How could I admit that in some ways I felt the same way? That his presence, his attention, his admiration even, had stirred something in me that had been dormant for so long? It was as though he saw parts of me that even Robert hadn't noticed in years. As if on cue, my son walked into the room at that exact moment, breaking the tension. I quickly composed myself, glancing at Thomas, who looked as startled as I felt. We both knew how close we'd come to saying too much, and the interruption was a harsh reminder of the reality we couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about the two of us. It was about my family, my marriage, and my own integrity. After that day, I tried to distance myself. I told myself to focus on Robert, on my family, and to forget whatever fleeting feelings I had for Thomas. But it wasn't easy. His words echoed in my mind, pulling me into a confusing cycle of what-ifs. One evening, when I was alone in the house, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Thomas. Just seeing his name on my screen made my heart race, but I knew I shouldn't reply. I couldn't open that door any further. But he texted again, asking if he could talk to me, saying he felt terrible for what he'd put me through, and that he didn't want to lose our friendship. It was a message that tugged at both my guilt and my sympathy. Against my better judgment, I replied, saying we needed to set boundaries. I told him that we couldn't let these emotions interfere with our lives, that it was unfair to everyone involved. He agreed, but his response hinted at regret, a sadness that seemed to mirror my own. He told me he understood and that he'd respect my wishes, though he wished things could have been different. From that day on, we kept our distance. Thomas stopped coming around as much, and when he did, he was cordial and polite, treating me as he always had. It was like a silent understanding between us, an agreement to bury our emotions and let them fade with time. But the truth was, I knew they'd never fully disappear. In some corner of my mind, the memory of what almost happened lingered like a quiet secret, a reminder of how thin the line between loyalty and temptation can be. It's a line I'll never cross, but it's one I'll always remember. Now, every time I look at Robert or hear my son's laughter, I'm reminded of what I almost risked. and the choice I made to stay true to them both. It wasn't easy, and part of me will always wonder what might have happened if things had been different. But some secrets are better left unspoken, buried deep in our hearts where they can do no harm. As time passed, the memory of what almost happened faded, though it left a subtle, lingering ache, a reminder of the complexity of human connections and the strength required to honor the ones that matter most. Thomas drifted out of our lives gradually, finding reasons not to visit as often. He eventually moved to a different city, and our occasional messages turned into silence. Sometimes I'd think about those quiet moments and the pull we'd felt toward each other, but it all seemed like a distant, foggy memory. In a way, that distance was a gift. It allowed me to focus on my family, my marriage, and the happiness I'd nearly taken for granted. I began to appreciate Robert more, remembering all the reasons we'd built this life together. And every time I saw Ethan's innocent face, I felt a renewed sense of gratitude for the life I'd chosen and the line I hadn't crossed. Looking back, I realized that sometimes the hardest choice is the one that keeps everything intact. And while Thomas will always hold a unique place in my memory, it's a chapter that's better left closed, a reminder of the strength it takes to hold on to what truly matters.